It's hard. It's so difficult. I can't tell you how hard it is. You're judged. Everybody judge you. You really are. No matter what you do, you're judged. Why is Michael Jackson coming over our house? Why would he want to be with us? Why would you want to be somewhere? You want to be with someone, and you're watched and you're judged. And it's why? You know, it was like, leave me alone. I just want to try to fit in.
Michael Jackson was, by almost any measure, the most famous person on earth for a significant portion of his adult life. His face was recognized in countries where people could not name their own head of government. His music crossed language barriers and cultural divides in ways that almost no other artist has ever managed. And yet, by the accounts of the people who were actually closest to him, he spent a large part of that life feeling profoundly, genuinely, and specifically alone. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from having no one around. Michael Jackson almost always had people around him: staff, associates, people connected to the machine of his career in various ways. The kind of loneliness he described, in interviews and in private conversations later recounted by those he trusted, was something more specific and more painful than simple physical isolation. It was the loneliness of not knowing who in that crowd of people actually cared about him as a person, as opposed to what he represented or what being near him could provide. It was the loneliness of an entire industry built around extracting value from his talent, while offering very little genuine protection or honesty in return. And it was the loneliness of being one of the most analyzed, discussed, and publicly dissected human beings of the 20th century, without feeling that any of those discussions actually captured who he was. This is the story of why Michael Jackson felt isolated by the music industry that built his career, and the specific, documented people he actually trusted within it. Michael Jackson entered the professional music industry as a child. He was performing with the Jackson 5 by the time he was old enough to be in elementary school. The structure of the industry that shaped his earliest years was one in which children had almost no power over their own careers, their own earnings, or their own creative direction. Adults made the decisions. Business arrangements were signed. Money moved in directions that the young performers at the center of all of it frequently did not fully understand until years later. The relationship between the Jackson family and Motown Records, the label that launched the Jackson 5, has been described by multiple family members across the years as one that was commercially successful and personally constraining in equal measure. Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, had enormous control over how the group was presented, what they recorded, and how their public image was constructed. The creative input of the artists themselves was limited in ways that became increasingly frustrating as they grew older and more confident in their own instincts. When Michael Jackson eventually moved to Epic Records and began working with producer Quincy Jones on the Off the Wall album in 1979, something shifted. For the first time, he was in an environment where his own creative instincts were taken seriously by a collaborator who had the skill and the experience to help him realize them fully. Quincy Jones has spoken extensively about recognizing in Michael Jackson a level of musical intelligence and a quality of instinct that he considered genuinely rare in his long career. But even as his commercial success grew into something unprecedented with Thriller, and as his position within the industry became one of unrivaled power on paper, the underlying dynamic between Michael Jackson and the institutional forces surrounding his career remained complicated. The industry valued what he produced. It was far less consistent in valuing him. He spoke about this directly in a 2002 speech that many people at the time dismissed, and that has only been taken more seriously in the years since. He described the music industry as a system that built artists up in order to extract from them, and that became hostile to artists who tried to assert too much independent control over their own careers and their own output. He named specific examples. He described his own situation as a direct illustration of what he was talking about. The people who were most invested in dismissing what he said were, almost without exception, the people with the most to lose if the industry took his critique seriously. In the years since his death, broader conversations about artist ownership, fair royalties, and the specific treatment of black artists in the recording industry have become significantly more mainstream. The concerns Michael Jackson raised publicly in 2002, which were treated at the time as the frustrations of an eccentric and commercially declining star, look considerably different when placed alongside the industry-wide reckoning that followed in the years and decades after. He was not wrong about what he was describing. He was simply saying it before the industry was ready to hear it. The most publicly documented example of Michael Jackson's isolation within the music industry came through his extended and bitter dispute with Sony Music and its leadership during the early 2000s. The dispute had its roots in his ownership of the ATV Music Publishing catalog, which he had purchased in 1985 on the advice of his attorney John Branca. That catalog contained a significant portion of the Beatles' songwriting library, alongside thousands of other valuable compositions. In 1995, he merged it with Sony's own publishing arm to create the joint venture Sony ATV Music Publishing, retaining a 50% stake. By the time Invincible was released in 2001, Michael Jackson believed Sony had deliberately failed to support the album's promotion in ways that would have ensured its commercial success. He believed the label's behavior was connected to the catalog dispute and to a broader institutional interest in weakening his financial position sufficiently to pressure him into selling his share of Sony ATV at a price that favored the company. Whether or not every specific element of that interpretation can be fully confirmed, the underlying dynamic was real. Michael Jackson, simultaneously one of Sony's most valuable recording artists and a 50% partner in one of their most important business assets. That combination gave him leverage that the label found difficult to manage. And the relationship between an artist who understood his own leverage and a corporation with significant institutional interests in controlling it was never going to be straightforward. His public statements during that period, standing in Harlem in July 2002 and naming executives he believed were working against him, were not the irrational outbursts of a person in crisis. They were specific, named, detailed allegations from someone who had spent decades watching how the industry operated and who had finally decided he had nothing left to lose by saying exactly what he thought publicly. The cost of those statements was real. His commercial position within the industry became more difficult. The collaborative relationships he had built over years were strained, and the isolation he already felt within the industry deepened into something more visible and more public than it had been before. Against the backdrop of that institutional isolation, the question of who Michael Jackson actually trusted becomes genuinely significant. Because trust, for someone in his position, was not a simple or casually extended thing. It was something built carefully, tested over time, and given only to people who had demonstrated, through specific behavior across specific situations, that they were not simply there for what his proximity could provide. Quincy Jones occupies a specific place in that picture. Their professional collaboration across Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad represented a genuine creative partnership of a kind that Michael Jackson rarely found again in quite the same way. Jones has spoken about the working relationship with warmth and specificity that goes beyond standard industry retrospective. He described Michael Jackson as someone who knew exactly what he wanted musically, who communicated that knowledge with precision, and who was also genuinely open to being challenged by a collaborator he respected. That combination of certainty and openness is something Jones described as genuinely unusual in his experience. Elizabeth Taylor was someone Michael Jackson spoke about publicly and privately with a depth of feeling that clearly went beyond celebrity friendship. She was one of the very few people in the world who understood, from direct personal experience, what it actually meant to grow up in the full glare of public attention before you were old enough to understand what you were agreeing to. That shared experience created a foundation for a connection that neither of them could easily have found elsewhere. He named her as a guardian of his children in his will. That is not a gesture made towards someone you know only casually. Diana Ross represented a similar kind of connection, built across a long shared history that predated his adult fame. She had known him as a child performer. She had watched him develop. She understood the context of who he was before the global icon took over the entire narrative. Michael Jackson spoke about her in terms that made the nature of the connection clear. She was someone who knew him from before. In his world, that mattered enormously. His longtime attorney, John Branca, despite the complicated history of their professional relationship, including periods where they did not work together, represented someone whose specific expertise Michael Jackson genuinely valued and whose judgment he trusted on the business decisions that mattered most. The fact that Branca was named as co-executor of his estate in his final will reflect the durability of that trust across decades of a relationship that was not always smooth. His mother, Catherine, represented something different from all of the professional relationships. She was the constant, the person whose presence in his life was not contingent on any business arrangement or any aspect of his public identity. The specific warmth with which he spoke about her, and the care he took to ensure her financial security in his estate planning, reflects a relationship that remained genuinely central to him, regardless of everything else that changed around it. Understanding why Michael Jackson felt isolated by the industry requires understanding what the practical reality of his daily life actually looked like, because isolation in his situation was not the same thing as isolation in most people's experience. He was surrounded by people almost constantly. His properties employed large numbers of staff. His tours required enormous production teams. His legal and business affairs involved lawyers, accountants, and managers. Every public appearance involved security personnel, publicists, and handlers. By the simple measure of how many people were physically present in his life, he was never alone. But almost every one of those people was there because of what he was, rather than because of who he was. Their presence was contingent on his continued functioning as a commercial entity. Their loyalty was, at least in part, structured by financial arrangements rather than by genuine personal connection. That is not a criticism of those individuals. It is simply the reality of what it means to be a person whose name is worth hundreds of millions of dollars and whose continued activity generates income for dozens or hundreds of other people. In that context, finding genuine connection became an exercise in constant uncertainty. When someone was particularly warm, was it because they actually cared, or because warmth was professionally useful to them? When someone gave advice, was it in his interest or in theirs? When someone stayed loyal during difficult periods, was it because of genuine commitment or because the professional relationship still held value? He talked about this in interviews with an honesty that interviewers often did not quite know how to respond to. He said that the difficulty of knowing who to trust was one of the defining experiences of his life. That fame of that scale created a kind of isolation that was invisible from the outside because it was surrounded by so much activity and so many people, but that was felt very specifically by the person living inside it. The people who made it into his genuine inner circle, the ones he actually trusted, were almost universally people whose connection to him predated his greatest commercial success, or people whose own independent position in the world meant that what they could gain from proximity to him was not the primary reason they were there. There is also something worth noting about his children in this context. Prince, Paris, and Blanket represented the one category of relationship in his life that was entirely free of any of these complications. They did not need anything from him professionally. They were not there because of what his name was worth. They were simply his children, and his relationship with them was the one space in his life where the calculations that governed almost every other connection simply did not apply. The warmth with which he spoke about them, and the centrality of their well-being to every major decision he made in his final years, reflects how much that kind of uncomplicated connection meant to someone for whom uncomplicated connection was genuinely rare. The story of Michael Jackson's isolation within the music industry is not a simple story of victimhood or of a famous person complaining about the difficulties of fame. It is a specific and documented account of how an industry built around extracting commercial value from creative talent operated in relation to one of the most commercially valuable artists it had ever encountered. He understood the system. He had grown up inside it from childhood. He had watched it operate across decades, and he had identified, with increasing clarity and increasing directness as he got older, the specific ways in which it prioritized institutional interests over the well-being of the artists at the center of it. The people he trusted were the people who existed outside that system, or who had demonstrated through specific behavior over significant time that their relationship with him was not simply a function of what the system had made him worth. Quincy Jones, who challenged him creatively because he respected what Michael Jackson was capable of. Elizabeth Taylor, who understood from personal experience what he was living. Diana Ross, who had known him before the global icon took over. Katherine Jackson, who was simply his mother. John Branca, whose specific expertise he valued and whose professional judgment he trusted across 3 decades of a complicated relationship. Those relationships are worth understanding because they tell you something true about him that the public narrative, built around the spectacle and the controversy and the commercial numbers, almost never captured. He was someone who valued genuine connection above almost everything else, and who found it genuinely difficult to come by in a life structured almost entirely around his commercial value. That difficulty, and the specific people who made it through it to the place where he actually trusted them, is one of the most human and most overlooked dimensions of his story. What do you think about who Michael Jackson truly trusted, and whether the industry treated him fairly. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there is still so much more of this story worth telling.